Hello and welcome to our weekly Parsha Shir with the commentary of the Alshich HaKodesh. This week's Alshich Shir is dedicated to somebody called Matthew Starr, Dr. Matthew Starr. And I got an email from Matthew this morning saying that I first taught him in 1980 when he was 13 years of age. He was at Haberdasher ASCII School. And he came to the wonderful organization, a wonderful organization that existed in those days in the UK called JYSG, which stands for Jewish Youth Study Groups. The parallel here in America is NCSY. And I actually remember Matthew, that will come as a surprise to him, certainly his name. And he wrote to tell me that my shir that he heard there at that time, when he said I fraudulently said that I was going to make water a combustible material, I didn't. I said I was going to teach them how to do it, which I did. But he said it was his first year and it started him a journey. And today, Matthew is blessed to live in Yerushalayim in Har Nof. So for him, his family, and as a grandson as well, I want to say, Matthew, thank you very much for being in touch. Your email was so moving and so heartwarming. And it's lovely to hear that not only did you hear my shirim at the beginning of your Jewish journey, but apparently you listen to them every week here as well. So it's a thrill, a real thrill, and an honor to have you here every week. And so for you and your family, this Al Shashir is dedicated to you. If you would like to have the share dedicated to you, we have a dedication again for next week. These are rare occurrences, and don't think for one moment I'm trying to guilt trip you into sponsoring the share. Not for one moment. Take a couple of minutes in that one. I don't mind guilt tripping you. But if you would like to be one of those rare individuals, there is the new email address, yy@askrabbiyyy.com. Show us that again, Rabbi. yy@askrabbiyyy.com. And we'd be very happy to dedicate it to commemorate something, a celebration, a simcha, or a reunion like the one that Matthew and I are having tonight. This week's Parsha is the Parsha of one of the most remarkable Jews in the history of Klal Yisrael. Now, as I keep reminding you, this is the second series of the Alshich. So you'll find the last year's Alshich shir in Torah Anytime, or if you're watching this in my YouTube channel, you'll find it there as well. Having said that, we're going to move on from where we left off last time and go into more intriguing territory with regards to the famous Yisro. I have to take you a little bit back to last year's shir on the assumption you haven't listened to it recently and your memory isn't so good that you remember it from last time, just to, as it were, get us into what it's all about. The question the Alshich asked last year, or asks, and we concentrated on last year, is when it says, "V'yishma Yisro Kohen Midyan Chos Moshe Eskol Asher Asa Elokim LaMoshe Yisro Hamoy." And it was that Yisro heard, Yisro, who was the Kohen Midyan, the priest of Midyan, he was the father-in-law of Moshe, Chos Moshe. He'd heard everything that Hashem had done for Moshe and the Jewish people. And the problem was, said the Alshich, there's a problem here. Rashi says right at the beginning of the Parsha that Yisro has 7 names. Now, we're going to move on to that very shortly, going back to the 7 names in this year's Alshich, and this Alshich shir that we're doing now. But last year we pointed out, or rather we pointed to the Alshich who points out that there's a contradiction here. Because the 7 names that he had, Yisro was Yeser was one of them was Yeser. Yeser defines a new Parsha added to the Torah through him, which is enormous. As Rabbi Desta says, to be named in the Torah meant you were an outstanding, remarkable, great individual. Now, you might have been a bad person, but you were outstandingly bad person, but a giant. However, perhaps like Paroi or Bilam, Bollock. These are all named people. They're all not nice people, but they were outstanding. They were remarkably important individuals, even in a negative sense. To be named in a positive sense is how much more so. But that's just to be named, but to have a whole part of the Torah, an element of the Torah, inserted into the Torah through you, because of you, and named after you, is surely an indication of some true greatness, which is what we're going to be talking about really in this year's Alshich. But let me just remind you of last year's, because 7 names: Yisro, Putiel, Caini. I'm not going to read the whole list to you. And Yisro when he became a Jew. The Yisro when it indicates an extra parsha, an extra part of the Torah, inserted through him. But Yisro is the name when he became a Jew. The question we asked then, or rather the Alshich asked then, was V'yishma Yisro Cohen Midian. And Yisro, who was the Cohen Midian, heard everything that God had done for Moshe and the Jewish people. And the problem, I'm sure you can spot that yourself, was really pretty obvious. If Yisro is the name that he was given when he was a Jew, then he wasn't the Cohen Midian. Midian was a place of idolatry. When he was the Cohen Midian, the priest of Midian, he was the priest of an idolatry. In fact, as we know, as Rashi said, he'd been the high priest to every idolatrous religion in the region at the time. He joined them, scaled the ranks to become the head of them, but saw it was false and lies, went on to the next one and the next one and the next one, a man desperately seeking the truth. But when he finds the truth, then he gets a new name, Yisro. Before that, then he's Cohen Midian, the priest of Midian. So why does it say V'yishma Yisro Cohen Midian? And there's a contradiction there. Not only that, as we pointed out, as the Gemara says in Bava Metzia and Nuntes, Amud Beis, or maybe it's Nuntes, I didn't check that, I can't remember, Nuntes or Nuntes, it says that there are 2 people you mustn't remind of their origins of the background, because it might be an embarrassment to them. One is a Baal or Baalat Shuva, somebody who was Jewish but not brought up religious, or was religious, went off and comes back again. To remind them of those those experiences and that different personality or history they once had is inappropriate. You don't talk to people about their backgrounds if it might embarrass them. To embarrass somebody is, certainly in public, the Talmud says, better throw yourself into a fire and die in the most horrible way than embarrass somebody in public. So you're not allowed to remind somebody is a Baal Tshuva. You're not allowed to remind somebody that he or she is a ger or gerus. Same idea. So don't go to the Baal Tshuva and say, oh, wow, you're a Baal Tshuva. What does bacon taste like? And don't say to a ger, as I joked last year, oh, so the Pope was your father, or whatever it was. You're not supposed to remind people of that. And yet the Posuk here, the Torah, does exactly that. V'yishma Yisro Cohen Midian. Yisro, the Jew, remember Rashi says of the 7 names, Yisro is the name that defines and designates him as a Jew. And yet it says, V'yishma Yisro Cohen Midian. So there's a contradiction. When he was Cohen Midian, he wasn't Yisro. When he was Yisro, he wasn't Cohen Midian. And how can you remind him of his origins in the first place? But Yishma Yisro Cohen Midian. So the Alshich said there something very brilliant. And that was, it's not talking about chronology, because if you're talking chronologically, then it's a contradiction. As we said, chronologically, when he was a Yisro, that's after he was the Cohen Midian. When he was the Cohen Midian, it's before he was a Yisro. But we're not talking chronology, we're talking methodology. How did he become the great person he became? And the Alshich says the answer is in the first word, V'yishma. He listened. The whole world heard what happened at the Exodus and the miracles and the splitting of the Red Sea, but he listened. And there's a difference between hearing and listening. To listen is to pay attention. The word V'yishma actually connotes also considering, thinking about this. So it's interesting that in the whole world have heard about this, but ultimately there's only one person who makes a big difference to his life and wants to become Jewish. There is, of course, another, and that is Rochov. And arguably, Rochov reached a greater level as a consequence of listening to what Hashem had done for the Jewish people of the Exodus, a greater level than Yisro. Certainly, you could make out an argument in primary Jewish sources for that conclusion. Having said all that, that's me setting the stage for the part of the story I want to move into now. So just to fill you in the background, or get us up to speed, as they say, he comes and he brings his daughter, Zipporah, Moshe's wife, and his 2 sons, and off they come to join the Jewish people. And then Moshe welcomes them, takes them in. And then if I turn the page here of my little art scroll Chumash, and that's page 396 we're on, if those of you have that at home, then it says he tells them the whole thing. And then the third line here, positive test, after the whole story, it says Vayichad Yisro. And Yisro Vayichad. Now, Vayichad is the word which is going to give us a bit of a headache here. And we'll have to see what the Alshich has to say. But first, I'll show you Rashi. Vayichad Yisro al kol hatoiva asher osa Hashem Yisro. And Yisro was Vayichad. His reaction was Vayichad. His reaction was Vayichad, which we're not translating yet. He had a reaction designated by the word Vayichad because of all the goodness that Hashem had done, Asher Osa, Hashem Israel, Asher Hatzilam, and had saved them from the Egyptians. That's the splitting of the Red Sea. That's the point which I really want to focus on in this week's shiur, or I'm going to show you the Alshich in a second. I'm also going to take you to two Chassidish stories this week. The first one is they're both my two most favorite Chassidish stories. The Divrei Yoel of the Satmar Rov, Zecher Tzadik Kodesh Livrocha, and the Shem Shmuel, another great Chassidish Rebbe. So we will look at what they have to say shortly. However, having said that, let's go back to this thing, the Yichad. Here's our mysterious word. Having heard about the Exodus, the salvation of the Jews, the destruction of the Egyptians, Vayichad Yisro. Yisro was Vayichad. What does that mean? So Rashi says here, and we're going to come back to this shortly. What does it mean, Vayichad? Vayisma. So one translation of Vayichad, says Rashi, is he was happy. He was happy, he rejoiced when he heard how Hashem had saved the Jewish people and what he'd done to the people who were trying to kill him, the army chasing after them. Vayismach Yisro. Zeh pshutai, says Rashi. That is the straightforward translation of the word Vayichad. However, he says a Medrash Agoda, but the Medrash, in fact, the Gemara in Sanhedrin, the Gemara in Sanhedrin says differently. Nasa b'sorei chadudim. His skin was covered in goosebumps. In other words, he was upset. He was distressed at what had happened to the Egyptians. Now, remember, of course, he was there. He was one of Pharaoh's advisors. He disassociated himself from the policy of affliction of the Jewish people, but he was part of Egyptian society. He was at the highest echelons, and he gets very upset. Neitzer al Ebed Mitzrayim, he got upset about the destruction of the Egyptians. Hainu de Omri Inshi. That's why there's a saying, a well-known saying, Geura ad Esra Dori lo tevaze aroma ba'apeh. This is the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Tzadik Daled, Omad Aleph, we'll come back to that. A convert to Judaism, for 10 generations, you mustn't say nasty things about a non-Jewish person in front of them. There's still a certain level of connection between this person and his background and his history. And 10 generations, incidentally, is a euphemism for forever. So if somebody is a ger or geras, then don't say nasty things in front of them about non-Jewish folk. That because when Yisro heard about the destruction of the Egyptians, he was distressed. In other words, you'll be pressing the distress button. That's the point. Now, let's have a quick read. It's just a very short paragraph I'm going to read to you this week from the Alshich. And for those of you who sometimes struggle to figure out these questions and have to pause to look at the Chumash to work it out, the good news is I'm just going to jump straight into the Alshich this week. And this is what he says. Now he's going to focus on this point that we mentioned before from last year's shiur, V'yishma Yisro Kohen Midian. And he says the following thing. It says, V'yishma, L'bal yala alev she'ikar kavonosei hoyasa lahoylech bitoy v'nov lebado. It's saying, and Yisro heard, because you see, he brings, as we mentioned, his Moshe's wife, his daughter, and his Moshe's two sons to Moshe. You might think, if you're cynical and skeptical by nature, I hope you're not, that maybe it's because, wow, he's now related to the king of the Jewish people, the whole nation, who've defeated the most powerful nation in the world, it'd be good to reestablish relationships with this person, this king. And maybe he went there to advance himself. The Alshich says that's not true, and the Posse indicates that. It says the Yishma, so the person should not think cynically. His intention was simply to return Moshe's lost family to him. That's all he was doing there. But when he got there and he saw that the Jewish people were living in an incredibly supernatural way, and what was that? They had the Mon that came from Shemaim, as we read in last week's Parsha, and these mysterious, miraculous clouds which surrounded the Jewish people on all sides, and including on the top, moderating the temperature. They had effectively central heating at night, and they had air conditioning during the day, and of course also kept out enemies. And they had the Be'er, they had this miraculous well that accompanied them on their journey, so they had lots to drink in the middle of the desert. And he discovers that his son-in-law is the king. That's when he decided to become Jewish. I'll join the winning team, which seems to make sense. If you're going to support a team, you want the winners. Well, the Jews are the winners at this stage of history. And so that you shouldn't think that. It says, by Yishma, Yisro, Cohen Midyan. By Yishma, Yisro, Cohen Midyan. Now, why? By saying that the Yisro, the Cohen Midyan, heard, does that dispel this cynical conclusion? It's as if to say, he says, Loimer, Kihen Emes, Shabe'ez, Shmias, Hoyo Boy, Bechinis Yisrei, Shutar Yadus. When he heard about this, when he heard about all the miracles that happened to the Jewish people and the splitting of the Red Sea, he was Yisro. And as we said, Yisro designates him as a Jew. So why are we talking about him as being Cohen Midyan, which designates him as not a Jew? Now here the Alshich gives a different answer, and I think this, if we pause for a second and think about it in our own lives, this resonates a little bit with me. Now, I mentioned before my dear old Talmud, Matthew Starr. Sorry, not so old. I'm old. He's not old. And the fact that he now lives in Israel, but he is a British Jew originally. There is, for those of us who have dual nationality, or have maybe lived a long time in one country, inevitably, you don't have to come on to the story of people who converted, but there's a certain affection for, interesting if Matthew gets in touch with me, there's still an affection for their Heim, as they say, the old country. You do feel a certain connection to the place that you were born. And the Talmud talks about that. The place that you were born has a special place in your heart. But the three things the Talmud says: you can't insult a man's wife, a man's Rebbe, and the place where he was born. And the Talmud tells an interesting story about a Rosh Yeshiva that found some boy in his yeshiva looking very forlorn, melancholy, and depressed, and he was homesick. He said, "Where do you live?" "Such and such a place." "Is it very beautiful?" "No, it's a swamp," he said. The Talmud says that even if it's a swamp, even if it came, I was going to say even if it came from Glasgow, that would be really unfair, then you still get homesick. But Glasgow means fair green place, I should point out. No swamps in Scotland. So basically, you still have an affection from the place that you came from. Okay, now, so therefore, it wants to tell you when he comes to the Jewish people, he's already Yisro, he's already embraced Judaism. But what's this, therefore, reference to Cohen Midyan? So listen to what he says. I think this, I say, with that little story, this will resonate. And that is the Torah. So he'd already, Bechinas Yisro, who Torah Yadus, he'd already accepted Judaism. But Torah Cohen Midyan, but it still says he was a Cohen Midyan. What does that mean to say? There's a residue of his background, which is still within him. That these two aspects of who and what he was, the Jew, somebody who embraces and sees that, still with a connection to his history. And there was a struggle. There was a struggle. So when he comes, he has embraced Judaism, but he's a bit of a newbie. He's a bit, he's green to it. And there's still, he feels connected to the past. Maybe it's a very bad example, but there was a famous Rosh Hashiva, maybe I shouldn't even mention his name, but who came from New York, sadly passed away. He was a famous um, personality. And when he grew up in New York, he was a great fan of baseball, and he was a fan of the New York Yankees. I think I can probably tell you his name because I think he made this well-known enough story, and he told it himself. He's called Rav Scheinberg, Pinchas Scheinberg, who was truly a tzaddik, and he told somebody once how much he celebrated when I think he was in his 70s or 80s when somebody told him of the score of the end of the year, the end of the baseball season, with the New York Yankees. And even though they'd done well, he'd now disconnected. Isn't that interesting? It can take a lifetime living in the Holy Yerushalayim to, as it were, sever those ties to the place that you were born, even as it were, if it was a swamp, even from the New York Yankees. Anyway, so it's these two dynamics, the present and the past, at that stage when he comes, are still in conflict. They're still pulling him. He's being pulled both ways, which is interesting. So, but the Alshich is going to point out something which is absolutely fabulous. So if we look, the Yishma Yisro Kavan Midian, so the first posuk, the Yishma Yisro Kavan Midian, at that stage when he comes to the Jewish people, or when he on his way to the Jewish people, he's in flux, he's in conflict over these two aspects of who and what he is. But the Alshich is going to say very briefly, I'm going to tell you right away. I'll read it to you in the Hebrew, but I've got to tell you straight away because it's so exciting. The next posuk, Vayikach Yisro, Moshe Esipor. But when he takes them to Moshe, it doesn't say he was a Kohen Midian anymore, but Yikach Yisro, the father-in-law of Moshe. At that point, he's made his decision. He's cut those ties. He no longer has an affection for the swamp, for the baseball team, for the football team, for the country he comes from. He's totally embraced his new life. So let me read that to you in the Hebrew of the Alshich, and then let me take you to my two other my Chassidish Sforim that we're going to delve into tonight. So let me read on. Kedera kol goy, because that's what any person who wasn't Jewish, who comes and embraces Judaism, Hosam belibo el Hashem, who decides he wants to become Jewish. It's a struggle. It's a battle. It's not just, oh yeah, I think I'll become a Jew. And it's suddenly everything you've been, everything you are, your history, your affections, your parents, suddenly you just cancel them out. There's no such cancel culture. You can't just sever that bond. There was I can't resist telling this story. There's a famous Rosh Hashiva. And this Rosh Hashiva, in his yeshiva, there was a ger. And this ger, I don't think was a Yisro, very far from it. And basically, when the fellow's mother came to visit her son, who'd embraced Judaism, basically what happened was, if I remember the story correctly, he was staying with somebody, and the rabbi opened the door, and there's this little non-Jewish lady quaking in her shoes coming to the house of the rabbi. Very scary. Fear of the unknown is enormous. How can I help you? I'm here to see her son. And he said, who are you? I'm his mother. Oh, said the rabbi, please come in. And he takes her in, sits her down. Can I get you a cup of tea? I'll just get your son. Would you like a cup of tea? So he thanks you for a cup of tea. And he calls up the stairs this fellow's name. Your mother's here to see you. Right, said the voice. And so he left and went into the kitchen to leave them to have a conversation. 5 minutes later, he came out and sees that the poor lady's still sitting there, shaking in her shoes with a cup of tea. And he shouts out the fellow's name again. Pliny, do you hear me? Your mother's here. Right, I'll be right down. Well, this time he looked out after a few minutes and he's still not down. So he went upstairs. For goodness sake, your mother's sitting downstairs waiting for you. Tell the shiksa to go away, he said. And was promptly expelled from the yeshiva. That's the way I remember it. That's the way it should have been. even if you've embraced a new life, still your mother. You treat her with love and respect, and that's how the Rosh Hashiva looked at it. Fine. But that treating somebody with respect doesn't mean to say that the values that you once had are the values you carry forward and you share. Not at all. He didn't share. He shouldn't share the same values. He's rejected them. But you treat every human being, especially the one who brought you into the world, with love and respect. Anyway, that's the point here. When he leaves, he's still in flux, but now he's totally committed. And he says it's the same with any non-Jewish person who's making such a journey. He will be in a state of conflict as he moves forward until he's able to confidently embrace and let go of the ideas, the ideals, and the affection he had from the world he came from, whether it's New York, Glasgow, or wherever. Right, so therefore, Yishma Yisro, Kon Median, B'Sham Shtei Bechinas. That's why it says at the beginning of the Pasuk, when he hears about it, before he comes to join the Jewish people, two aspects to him in conflict. Shehem Shtei Bechinas, Be'ez Shashmiya Bilvad. But that's just when he heard about it. Ach Kashenoda Rucho La'isa Lika Hasbitai. Kava Nitar Bedata Lias Roy Likra Oiser Beloy Kon Median. So that's why it says when he actually makes the journey, when he makes the commitment, when he goes on the journey to join the Jewish people, it doesn't say Kohen Midian anymore. He's now just Yisro. So that's beautiful, very interesting idea. So that's important from what we're going on to now. We're going on to discover exactly who he is in a second, but notice he did completely commit. But not only that, go back to what I said at the beginning of the Shir, as Rabbi Bessa says, he's got a parsha named after himself in the Torah. This is more than just an ordinary ger committing himself. Yisro is one of the most important personalities in the history of the Jewish people who is going to contribute so much to Klal Yisrael, make suggestions to Moshe Rabbeinu about how Klal Yisrael could be improved, which Moshe Rabbeinu agrees to. And we're carried forward on that basis. And when he leaves Moshe Rabbeinu, reported in Bahalosko, Moshe is so upset. Don't leave us. You will be for us le'inayim, says Moshe. You'll see things that we don't see from your different background. You'll have a perspective, a way of looking at things, which won't come naturally to us. You'll spot dangers that we wouldn't, where things are dangerous that look to us to be innocuous, that and actually could be toxic. That's the introduction to Yisro from the Alshich HaKodesh. Who was Yisro? Who was Yisro? Let's go into Kabbalistic territory. The Shem Lishmuel, as I said, is one of my favorite considerations for him. I quote him in my book, this one here, Truly Great, Jewish Women Then and Now. And if you think this is shameless publicizing of my new book, which is really good, you would be quite right. So it is. However, I did look at it to actually get this, the source of this, because you do a lot of research when you write a book, and sometimes you forget the sources. So let me read to you what I wrote here with regards to Yisro. And this you'll find, I'm sure, very interesting. This leads us to revisit something we learned in a previous exploration of other righteous women discussed in the previous chapters, because really the chapter is about Tzipporah, Moshe Rabbeinu's wife. However, the Zohar tells us that Moshe was a Gilgul. Moshe was a reincarnation of Hevel. Cain and Hevel, the two first children of humanity. Adam and Chava's two sons, Cain and Hevel. Of course, Cain kills Hevel, everybody knows the story. But the name of Hevel is very critical, because there is a concept in Judaism, Kashmoikin, who the name that you're given is ultimately who you are. The name hints at your nature. Hevel, what does Hevel mean? Anyway, Hevel means, Hevel is nothing. Hevel, Havolim, Hakol, Hovel, Shlomo Melech says famously, that everything is nothing, all the values of the world are nothingness. And he was called Hevel. Hevel saw himself as being a nothing. And Moshe Rabbeinu was a Gilgul of that. But let me read to what I said here. The Zohar tells us that Moshe was a Gilgul of Hevel, a reincarnation of Hevel. The Shem Mishmuel explains why Cain was the one to suggest the idea of bringing an offering to Hashem. So it was Cain, his brother, he instigated the idea. He came up with the idea of offering a sacrifice to God. And Hevel goes along with it. Anyway, and Hevel only followed Cain's lead. Cain was a doer and a fixer. Now that's important. Cain was a doer and a fixer. He liked to innovate and create new things. His very name suggests that nature, says the Shem MiShmo. It relates to word kinyan, which means acquisition, where an object, a person, or a thing changes ownership and status. He creates change. A Cain, a doer, is somebody who creates change in the world. You want to make a difference in the world. If you're a Cain, Hevel didn't. He went along with it, but it wasn't his idea. He's not a doer, a changer. Cain wanted to bring change to the brand new world in which he'd been born. Of course, innovation and change can be a very positive thing, I write here. However, there is an innate danger that comes when someone is a fixer. He feels pride in the things he's fixed, in the changes he's made, and as a consequence, his ego expands. And ego, Judaism declares to be the most dangerous thing that exists on the planet. Much better to be a humble person, of course, with danger and humility as well. For example, you won't innovate. You'll be a noshlepper, somebody who follows the lead of other people, as Hevel did with Cain. But the danger of Cain, who innovated, is it can feed and grow his ego. And a grown ego is a very dangerous thing. We've seen how toxic the process is to the human condition. Sorry, we've seen how toxic that process, ego, is to the human condition, and also how men are far more susceptible to toxicity than women. Of course, that's the theme of the book. Did I mention this book's worth having? Sorry, I might slip out. The symptoms of the condition appeared immediately. True, Cain came up with the idea, but he brought an offering that was basic, minimal, and grudging. He wanted to keep the best stuff in the world for himself. His attitude was that I need it. Hevel's offering was the opposite, a product of his nature. His character was humility. He did not try to alter things, even though the change might be positive. That approach was not in his being, which was innately averse to the danger of expanding his sense of self. The reason it wasn't is because he was aware and alert to the danger of innovation leading to ego, and because his basic nature was humility, he was allergic to things that might challenge his basic nature and reverse it. He was happy to follow his brother's leads and so offered the very best of his property to Hashem. Hevel's attitude was, why do I need the very best? His brother was, I need the very best. Hevel's attitude was, why do I need the very best? Okay, obviously both approaches, both attributes have positive and negative aspects. Hevel's humility played a part in his tragic demise and in invoking his brother's jealousy. Cain's ego created that jealousy and led to murder, in fact, the first murder in history. The Kabbalistic texts explain that Hevel was reincarnated as Moshe, whose defining character was humility. The second time, though, Moshe would get the balance of his innate character right. So the Torah tells us that the man Moshe was exceedingly humble, more humble than any man in the face of the earth. That's by Midbar, chapter 12 and verse 3. Yet Moshe did not allow his humility to prevent him from acting and fixing things. Here he gets the balance right. He doesn't run away from change. Now he's going to change. He's going to change the situation of the Jewish people. He's going to change the dominance of the Egyptians. He's going to change people that don't have the Torah to one that gets the Torah, and so on and so forth. He fixed the enslavement of the people in Egypt. He fixed their inability to leave. He saw to it that they stood in Mount Sinai and received the Torah. And he repeatedly fixed things when they angered Hashem through the golden calf and the spies and on many other occasions. Cain was reincarnated as Yisro. As Yisro. And the Medrash points out that one of the 7 names by which Yisro is known, as I mentioned at the beginning of the share, we're going to come back to this theme of the 7 names, was Caini, a Kenite. Cain indicated that he was a descendant of Cain. He was a reincarnation of Cain. In fact, he was the reincarnated Cain. Like Moshe, Yisro was brought to the world to repair the mistake he had made in his previous life. He was here to be the fixer who did not become poisoned by ego through the fact that he fixed and innovated something. And of course, as I said before, he innovates and he brings new things to the Jewish people, but it doesn't cause him to inflate his ego and become destroyed by it. So both in their second journeys take their basic nature, perfect it, and give so much back. But I want to take you to the Divrei Yoel. the Satmar Rov Tzaddik Livrocha, and what he has to say on the subject. And that takes us back to the Rashi, which says that you shouldn't remember this word we were struggling with, by Yichad Yisro. So what did it mean? When Yisro hears everything that Moshe has said, has told him that happened, from the salvation of the Jews to the destruction of the Egyptians, by Yichad Yisro. And he said that it means he rejoiced, he was happy. Which he said is a simple, straightforward meaning. The other one was that he became covered in goosebumps, from which you come to the conclusion that you must never, he was upset, he was distressed about hearing what happened to the Egyptians. You must not remind or criticize non-Jews in front of a ger forever, no matter how many generations. So this is what this is the two questions which the Divrei Yoel, well, actually asked many questions. The Divrei Yoel, by the way, Satmar Rov, who passed away, the end of the 20th century, but his style is like the Alshich, to ask questions. Probably, to be more accurate, more like the Orach Chaim, who also ask questions, because Hasidim love the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, but I'm sure he loved the Alshich too. But let me read to you what he says. Vayichad Yisro, and Yisro was Vayichad, this word. And the Gemara says in Sanhedrin, as we quoted before, Tzadik Daled Amud Aleph, Rav v'Shmuel. It's an argument between two rabbis. What does the word Vayichad imply? What does it mean? Rav Omer Shehever Cherev Chada al Yisro. Vayichad, the root of Vayichad, the vav is an and, the yud makes it into a verb, the chad is the root of the word, is sharp. And what does that mean? That, and it goes with the Rashi really, but literally he says, Rav says, it means he circumcised himself. He took a sharp knife and circumcised himself, and cut off his flesh, cut off his foreskin. Perish Rashi Zal Shemol es atzmim in his gair. He converted himself. He did bris milah and converted. That's the first opinion. Vayichad means, yes, he rejoiced, he became a Jew. But Shmuel disagrees. Shmuel Omer Shenasa Chadudim Kol Bisri, that he was covered in goosebumps, to which Rashi renders that as Shahaya Meitzer Ma'oid Al Michelas Mitzrayim. He was terribly distressed about the fall of Egypt and what happened to them. Omer Rav, and then Rav says, so that's the two opinions. So we've got Rav who says he was happy, and Shmuel who says he was upset. And then Rav turns around and says, that's why people get saying. Somebody's got who is a ger, or got a ger in his lineage or her lineage forever, don't say nasty things about non-Jews in front of them. Now this is very interesting, as the Satmar Rov is going to point out. You hear what's going on here? You see the dynamic? Two opinions. Rav says one thing, Shmuel says the other thing. Then Rav turns around and says, oh yeah, you're right. That's exactly, Shmuel, your point, that's exactly what people say. Remember, Shmuel said he was upset. So it's Rav who says that the implication of the Yichad means, he says, it means he was happy to become a Jew. And Shmuel says, no, it means he was upset. And Rav says, you know what? That's why people say, don't embarrass a convert by reminding them of, or saying nasty things about non-Jews in front of them. So Rav's now just defended Shmuel, whom he's arguing with, which is exactly the question which the Maharsha asked according to the Satmar Rov. I mean, Yisro, Lava Sirihu. And the Maharsha says, like a son of the Rav, Maise Raya L'Divrei Shmuel. It seems to be, Bar Plukta, it seems to be that Rav, who's arguing with Shmuel, brings an argument to defend or to prove his opponent is right, which makes no sense whatsoever. Good. And then says the Satmar Rov, Tzorach Lehavin. And there's another thing we have to consider. How is it conceivable to imagine about a tzaddik godel, that's Yisro? And now, again, let me remind you, not just a tzaddik godel, but somebody who actually brings a new aspect of the Torah out by inserting a new parsha in. How could it be that a tzaddik godel like that, ki Yisro, for your mates of a diag, ma'oid al ibud rishayim Mitzrayim, could be upset and worried about the destruction of not a people who were trying to kill and wipe out the Jewish people, an Egyptian army who were tracing to commit genocide against the Jews who fled. This is the SS chasing after Jews who have been liberated from a concentration camp, determined to kill them, running along the road just within rifle range of them. And along comes, I don't know, the RAF or the USAF, AF, I guess, and bombs them and kills them all. You'd be jumping up and down with joy. So, was he really upset? So, we've got two questions from the Devriya. So he says, I think this is absolutely brilliant, a brilliant answer. Well, there's he says, what this means, that Yisro makes him oid on Mitzrayim, that Yisro was upset about the fall of Mitzrayim. That's what he says. Yes, he was upset, but not because that they were killed. They deserved to be killed. He was upset because they didn't change their minds and not deserve to be killed. That's what upset him. And it was the famous story that when the Egyptians were killed at Kriyas Yamsuf, the Malachim wanted to sing Shira, songs of praise to God for what he'd done. And he said, oh no, don't you rejoice when my creatures are dying. I, Hashem, I would rather that they had done teshuvah and not been killed. If that's how Hashem looks at it, then as we're supposed to copy Hashem, that's how we should look at it as well. That, says the Devriya, is precisely how Yisro looked at it. His distress was not that he died, it's because they died because they didn't do tshuva. And that makes sense. And then he goes on to say at the bottom of the page, page 12 of the Devriya, and that is to say, but the Ashrik Gitzasai, the Gemara, Omer Rav, and the Omer Inish, and if we now can reconcile that for the contradiction, that Rav turns around and says, no, you're right. I say that, remember, let's do the argument again. Rav says, I say that he was happy. Shmuel says, no, he was upset. Rav says, but that's what people say. You should never remain begar. To which the Devriya says, what Rav was saying is, you're right. In general, you're right. That's what people say. That's the general saying. That people you shouldn't say about. That's true for most people, but not for Yisro. The man who had a passion named after in the Torah, who totally embraced, who started off, indeed, like anybody who's making that journey, any non-Jew who makes that journey is going to be a little bit compromised and have a little bit of affection from the background that he came from. Even if you're born Jewish, as I said from Rav Scheinberg, you're going to be tied to a little bit of your history. But Yisro leaves that behind. That's why it said, Bishma Yisro Cohen, there was that dynamic, there was that conflict at the beginning, but by the time he comes to join the Jewish people, he severed that link. Don't, says Devriya, say about tzaddik like Yisro, that he remained so, to some degree, connected that he was upset. Yeah, people say that in general, because in general that applies, you're right, for anybody else. But don't say that about Yisro. Yisro was one of the greatest Jews who ever lived, who had a whole parsha named after him. I'll look forward to seeing you again next week. We have another sponsor for next week already. But the week after that, oh, and again, can I just remind you, particularly for men, this is the book you need to buy. Truly Great Jewish Women, Men and Now. And you have it in your drawer. The next time you upset your wife and she's not talking to you, you take it out and say, darling, I was just passing a Jewish bookstore and I saw this in the window and I immediately thought about you. That's why men need to have it as much as women. A very good Shabbos. See you next week.